Hello, welcome to Everyday Anarchism. My guest today is Dilar Dirik, author of the new book, The Kurdish Women's Movement, History, Theory, and Practice. Dilar, this is a topic, Rojava, I said it wrong again, no, I said it right, Rojava, Kurdistan, the Kurdish Women's Movement, I mean, democratic confederalism, these are all terms that I hope we can define, that I've wanted to cover since I started this podcast a little over a year ago. And yet I could not find a work, an author, someone that I wanted to speak to until your book came along. So thank you so much for writing this book. I mean, it must have been a labor of love. It was clearly a labor.
Yeah, thank you so much, Graham. It's really nice to be on your program. I'm really looking forward to our conversation, and thanks for your kind words. It was definitely a labor, a big amount of labor, but also it was a labor of love. I wrote it in over a long period of time, and much of it was written during the pandemic, so it was a bit difficult as well. And of course, things are always happening at high speed in Kurdistan. Developments are always ongoing. So I hope it's when people pick it up and read it, they'll see how much there is still left to study. So many things that I didn't even get to write about because it's an old movement. It's a 4 decades old organized struggle. So there's much to cover, but I hope it's interesting to people.
Yes, well, I found the book interesting, although as we already discussed, it is a book that has so much in it. It's not a book like the recent David Graeber, David Wingrove book, which has a lot in it, but also leaves most stuff out and is kind of a page turner and is fun to read, and that's why it's sold however many copies. This is not that kind of book. I'm hoping this is the kind of book that will start, at least in the English language, a academic and intellectual conversation about the Kurdish women's movement and Kurdistan, because right now it seems very shallow. There's a sort of shallow NATO-style celebration of women with guns, which is great, as opposed to those other women who are oppressed. And then there's also a vaguely positive spirit in the internationalist left about this movement without any deep knowledge of it. I had no deep knowledge of it until I had read your book.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, is to say that many people, whether they are on the left or not, only started knowing more about, let alone the Kurdish women's movement or the Kurdistan freedom movement, about the Kurds in general, only after 2014. So, and that's because of the rise of the so-called Islamic State and the fight against it. And suddenly, for the first time ever in history, Kurdish women were featured in the mainstream, whether it's in academic scholarship, in the media, just culturally. It opened up debates in different political circles. And I always like to stress this because it's not like now we see more coverage, we see more engagement. So in a way, it's of course normal that people's knowledge of it is not so deep, because it's actually very recent that people even started writing books or articles and things like that. And also, of course, 2014, and I include myself in this, many of us wrote in emotionally mobilized ways, because it was a very, very it was a very crucial time in history in the Middle East and in the world. And so how the discourse was narrated, how it evolved, also had to do with this very intense period because of all these attacks and everything that happened ever since. So it's hard to do justice to a movement that is actually much more than what people have seen in a very short period of time. And I think this is particularly interesting and important, considering the question of the women's liberation, because it's very dangerous to think that it's only because of the weapons that women developed into a movement. You know, there's so much ideological depth, political history, resistance in prisons, in popular uprisings, in civil society, and inside society, in media, culture, art, that laid the foundations for the fight against ISIS. So what I wanted to do with the book is to make sure that people actually also can catch up, through my book or other sources, of course, the ones I cite, just to see that actually revolutionary struggles take long time. Transformation doesn't just happen overnight. Sometimes periods in history are very crucial, and what you do then matters a lot. But actually, most of the struggle is a long-term struggle. It's protracted. So in that sense, I think that was very important also because, as you mentioned, there is a very conscious and deliberate, I think, ideologically motivated desire to depoliticize movement, to represent it in ways that actually it doesn't see itself, and this is very dangerous. And I think this is an attack by the capitalist system also on changing the history of movements. So yeah.
Well, I was struck reading your book with the parallels to George Orwell's very famous account of the Spanish Civil War or the Spanish Revolution, that, when he was reading about it from outside, it was some sort of vaguely good liberal democratic thing fighting the fascists. And when he got there on the ground, he discovered it was actually much more revolutionary. And that actually explains to him why the liberal democratic governments were not fighting the fascists on the ground, because the governments actually knew that this was something very, very radical, and they wanted no part of that, although they were quite happy to vaguely frame it as part of the liberal democratic progressive movement. And I certainly see that same sort of coverage of the Kurdish movement.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the gender dimension is like key to understanding that, because this is not a liberal movement. It is a radical movement. It's a revolutionary movement. It's, there are different dimensions to it, but its ideological perspective is very much based on a deep critique of patriarchy, of capitalism, of the state especially. And so putting all of that aside and just focusing on the practice is not going to give anyone a good understanding of what this movement actually aspires towards. And also, it's also, I think, a way of separating struggles and movements from each other. So it's like, by making it look like something else, you prevent other radical and revolutionary kind of circles from approaching it. And here's where I think knowledge production on movements is very important. One needs to be very cautious and sensitive about it and have historical kind of awareness as much as possible about who is interested in portraying what movement in what way at what time. Because very often, the content, the kind of, actual historical meaning of any given struggle can be really instrumentalized for the powers of capitalism and imperialism and the state above all. And I think that's why it's always important to just go to the source, even if you cannot actually go to Kurdistan yourself, just to familiarize yourself more directly with what is coming from the movement rather than what the media is saying this movement is about.
Yeah, and that's why you wrote the book. For those people who haven't read the book, you wrote the book in some ways as an oral history as much as possible, the voices of the women who were in the movement. Before we get to those voices, I want, from the perspective of an anarchist intellectual podcast, which is very much what this is, I thought we could start by talking about Murray Bookchin briefly, and then Abdullah Öcalan, who adapted some of Bookchin's ideas to create democratic confederalism. And even before that, could you just explain very briefly who the Kurds are and where they are, in that people may not understand? I mean, everyone knows, I think, now about Syria, and with the recent protests, Iran, obviously Iraq and Turkey. All of these things come together in a way that look, in America, we're a long way away from this. We also don't understand the geography of Eastern Europe either. So if you can give us a little geographical lesson, and then we can get into the ideas animating this movement.
Sure, I can do that. So the Kurdish people live in an area that they call, or others have sometimes historically called, Kurdistan, which is a region in what is sometimes called Upper Mesopotamia, to refer to the ancient term. And that is also, I'm saying this because I want to stress that the history of the nation state in the region is actually very it's still very young, the nation state as an idea. So it only came into existence after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And subsequently, French and British diplomats, Sykes and Picot, acting on behalf of France and Britain, they basically divided this region into different parts, and this also constituted the so-called division of Kurdistan. And it's like, you have to be always careful, because who defines a region in what way. But basically this is usually referred to as the first and final also division of Kurdistan. Exactly in 1923 there was a treaty called the Treaty of Lausanne, which finalized this. So next year is actually the 100th anniversary. Oh. So this created the different nation states in the region. And so the Kurds live in Turkey, in Iraq, in Iran, and in Syria. And as a result of this kind of division into these different nation states, which were also very much shaped by European-style nationalisms, Arab nationalism, Turkish nationalism. Turkish nationalism in particular was very much based on this French model of the state, which is one nation, one language, one flag, and a secular state as well. But in general, Sunni Islam has dominated politics there. So the Kurds have, as a result, been minoritized, been denied their existence, and they have faced many genocides, actually, also in this history. There were uprisings also, however. So often these genocides and massacres happened in response to uprisings and rebellions. And so, yeah, the movement that I'm specifically talking about, and here's, again, an important thing to stress, is that there are many different Kurdish political traditions. So
yes. That came through very clearly in your book.
Yeah, so there were early nationalistic aspirations at the beginning of the 20th century to create an own independent Kurdish nation state, and there are many different political trajectories. So the one that I'm specifically focusing on is the movement that evolved around the Kurdistan Workers' Party, starting in the 1970s inside Turkish borders. So normally I would say Bakur, Bashur, Rojava, or Roshelat to talk about East, West, South, and North Kurdistan. But I'm going to avoid that just for the sake of this podcast, to avoid confusion. But Northern Kurdistan, this would be within the borders of the Turkish state. They're kind of mostly student-based, student and workers-based circle of political activists around Abdullah Öcalan, who himself also was a student at the time. They developed a perspective for, they very much came from the left inside Turkey. It was a socialist, a leftist group that was very much part of the revolutionary left at the time, which was very strong at some point in Turkey before the military coup in 1980, which decimated the left and imprisoned people, massacred, and so on. So there was at the time a reluctance in the Turkish left to talk about the so-called Kurdish question, which, the Kurds are not a small group. They're estimated to be about 20% of the Turkish population, in Turkey. And it is also a class issue, because those regions have been historically underdeveloped, and there has been always forced migration and violence against Kurdish people in the Republic. So there was that problem of not tackling the Kurdish question in Turkey, but also there were Kurdish political, nationalistic groups that were also not revolutionary, that were not taking a class perspective, that were not kind of resisting imperialism, but they wanted to just become part of the hegemonic system with their Kurdish identity. So the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, which was formed in 1978, formally in its Congress, and started armed struggle in 1984, after the famous Diyarbakir prison resistance in the 1980s, is basically presents itself as an alternative that says, we have to have, we need to solve the Kurdish, freedom question, basically. But this can only happen, from a revolutionary perspective that also, can be a solution for the peoples of the region. So it was never a chauvinistic kind of project that wanted to separate entirely from the Turkish population. In fact, some of the founding members were Turkish themselves, but to kind of have self-determination and autonomy for the Kurdish people at the time with an independent socialist Kurdish state. And again, this is like Cold War times, but over time, this changed, especially after the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the mass participation actually of many people, especially also women, who joined the guerrilla ranks from the villages, which were then destroyed by the Turkish army because of their support for the guerrillas. So in that time, in the 90s, this question of the state came to be picked up again. So I think we can like maybe continue from that when we talk about the role of Öcalan and influences on him. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, just keep going. This sounds perfect. I have no questions or comments.
All right. Yeah. So Abdullah Öcalan is currently imprisoned. He's a political prisoner, and he has been in prison since 1999. He was abducted on the 15th of February 1999 after leaving Syria and trying to seek asylum to find a political solution to the Kurdish question. So he had been based in Syria for 20 years, and the Kurdish, the movements, political structures, its education, its training for guerrilla warfare happened between Lebanon and Syria most of the time in this period, but also in the mountains of Kurdistan. So Kurdistan is a very mountainous region, as people will figure out at some point. So he was abducted in a NATO operation. This was led by the CIA, by the Mossad, by the British, and also, with the support of other, and of course the Turkish intelligence. And he was taken to Turkey as a result. And he's been there ever since. And he's the main ideologue. He has been historically the leader. He's one of the co-founders of the PKK. And a very charismatic figure who's very much, seen as like the leader. And however, of course, he's in prison, but he continued his writings and his perspectives from prison. And the 5 volumes he produced there, which are titled all together as the Manifesto for Democratic Civilization, that presented his new paradigm, which then became the framework for the new project of the movement around democratic confederalism, which basically is based on ecology, women's liberation, and radical democracy. It is a fundamental critique of the state and patriarchy and capitalism. So the critique of patriarchy is a very important part of his work. And it's also, it comes from before. So it didn't take him, only until he gets to prison to write these things. Already in the 90s, when he was still free, he had written, and also in the 80s, actually, he had written his first pieces on these questions. And the question of the state was already dropped from the program of the PKK in the mid-1990s. So sometimes people narrate the story in a kind of distorted way. There's sometimes people who read short accounts may have encountered a sentence like, when Öcalan went to prison, he had a radical rethinking, and then he gave up.
I've read accounts that say that exactly.
Exactly, and it's just wrong. It's factually, historically, it's wrong. And I think it's important to say this because it was not, it didn't happen because he was then imprisoned, or it's nothing to do with that. This is older. And actually, it was not something that he came up with by himself in the 90s. There were all kinds of discussions, and the women's movement's first steps towards autonomous and self-determined structures also came with his encouragement. So there's also the other thing that people sometimes may have heard is that, when he got imprisoned, the women's movement became more autonomous. That's not true as well. It's actually far from the truth. The first steps towards autonomous women's organization, the PKK, came with the active encouragement of Abdullah Öcalan when he was free. He suggested the formation of autonomous guerrilla units, an autonomous women's party, and things like that. So it was very much a dialogue. And so yeah, in prison, because you also asked about Mori Bökçin. Mori Bökçin's work, of course, is probably very well known to many people who are listening
Yeah,
to
I
the
think
podcast.
so.
But yeah, so basically he was among the people, among the titles that Öcalan was able to read. He always had only limited access to prison because he's just, maybe I should say this as well, he is currently confined, and he has been since 1999, on a prison island called İmralı. And for the first 10 years, he was the only prisoner and guarded by 1,000 soldiers. And it's a high security prison. He has no access to lawyers, to family. And so it's very important also to be aware of that, because he is actually the person who initiated the peace process again with the Turkish state. He has continues to have an immense amount of power. So isolating him means basically delaying a political solution, depriving him of his basic human rights. So he was able to read some of Murray Bookchin's books, and also there were other influences as well. So while I don't want to kind of diminish the influence of Murray Bookchin, I just want to say also, again, to help maybe demystify certain things, it also wasn't just because of Murray Bookchin that Öcalan developed his theories. Like, as I said, some of these things, like the critique of the state and patriarchy, they preceded his imprisonment. He started reading Bookchin in prison. So, but especially I would say maybe perhaps people may disagree, but I think one of the biggest influences that Murray Bookchin had on Öcalan is the question of ecology. And in particular, this understanding environmental or ecological issues as being fundamentally a question of power and hierarchy and domination. So he also draws on this like longue durée understanding of Bookchin, and also the Fernand Braudel and others who have kind of always argued to understand history in this long-term perspective, and not just based on what's been the latest development. So he's looking at a 5,000-year-old trajectory of domination and power, very much like Murray Bookchin. And the other thing, of course, also that I would say is has been a very big influence on him is the question of municipalism, how to organize locally. And again, it's interesting because I would say, and some people have written about this, Murray Bookchin has many references for his work and philosophy, also drawing on the history of Mesopotamia, of that same geography. And similarly, Öcalan is also trying to draw on existing like legacies of social self-organization without the state. These can be local traditions, indigenous belief systems, village structures, and how they have been solving problems and conflicts in their communities. So it's in a way a reanimation of these old practices that the state has destroyed. So I think the question of power and domination, this has been one of the biggest influences of Murray Bookchin on Öcalan, but especially I think the questions of ecology and municipalism and many other things. And I think it's been very nice to see how people who are in the world of social ecology have in the last years, in the last decade in particular, been so active in Kurdistan solidarity, so active in participating in all kinds of struggles, and also the other way around. I think many Kurdish people have learned a lot on ecology by befriending people from the world of social ecology. So that's a very nice and interesting ongoing intellectual and political relationship, I think.
I mean, I think you've cleared up some things for me that are, again, were part of the myth about Öcalan and Bookchin. So I really appreciate that. It makes sense that the ecology, that ecology and municipalism, those were the things that Bookchin is best known for contributing to the anarchist movement. So it makes sense that those were the things that were most influential on Öcalan. And then I guess I want to get to what it actually looks like in practice right now. But dare I say, again, this is my, I said your book was a sociologist book. I'm an intellectual historian. So here's the intellectual history bit. I am quite comfortable with my broad stroke understanding of anarchism as describing Öcalan, democratic confederalism, Bookchin, etc., as all broadly within the sense of anarchist movement, as in, autonomous, non-state movements of cooperation and eventually confederalism. Certainly, both Bookchin and Öcalan criticize anarchism in their work. And, obviously there's a long history of people who I would consider anarchists. William Morris is another example, who are to my mind, within a broad sense of anarchism, clearly anarchists, and yet the anarchist label is often associated with individualism or something like that, that these people just cannot bring themselves to adhere to. I don't know if you have or want to weigh in on that question of whether this is, quote, anarchism. I mean, the Zapatistas, it's the same sort of question, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a matter of definition. It's similarly the case with feminism, for example. Feminism and anarchism as such, they developed in certain parts of the world, that vocabulary. So it's a matter of how a concept, a practice, and method of organizing life has traveled, how it was picked up and engaged with, but also acknowledging that there were, historically speaking, similar ways of life, similar kind of perspectives that maybe didn't call themselves that. For example, it would be a massive injustice to thousands of years of women's resistance to start the story of women's resistance with feminism.
Yes.
You know, because it implies that people who have not used that label did not also think about liberating themselves from patriarchy or other forms of gendered oppression. So that's why, for example, the Kurdish women's movement, I recently did an interview on this question. I interviewed someone, and they were saying it would be an injustice to the history of the Kurdish women's movement and the history of feminism to conflate them without this kind of nuance, because the Kurdish women's movement did not come from feminism. It came from the struggle for a free Kurdistan. And then within that, an autonomous women's perspective developed, and it totally engages with the history of feminism, with feminists. It's participating in feminist platforms, and is saying always explicitly that we consider feminism as part of a legacy of human freedom. And likewise, anarchism, to say that what the movements, like basically Öcalan's terminology about democratic civilization or democratic modernity, that these are all with their different shades and shapes and forms, whether it's feminism, ecology, struggles, anarchism, youth cultures, artists, villagers continuing to live life without the state. So all of these can be seen as part of a freedom history. And I think that's a healthy way of understanding it, because I think, for example, there is a very deep critique of this, and this is what Öcalan is actually appreciating the most about anarchist thinkers and practices, is this very morally conscious critique of the state and power, and the ability of power to corrupt. And but what is important there, and this is where he agrees with Bookchin very much, is the need for organization. And it is a myth, of course, as we know, that anarchists are against organization. This is one of these very stereotypical things that people say to accuse them of certain things. But there is a reality that, especially in advanced capitalist countries, it is becoming more and more difficult for anyone really to organize because of individualism, because of all kinds of cultural bombardments, because of attacks by the state. It's easy for people to become paranoid and withdraw socially, or kind of splinter into so many fragmented groups. And that ultimately means that it's difficult for people to actually achieve anything and to win. So what is important is to not become part of a small bubble where everybody agrees, but to actually challenge power. And that means also laying hands on society and actually daring to open up, and this is what the Kurdish movement is trying to do. So in that sense, I think anarchism as like a very old and very rich tradition, a practice that is itself very diverse, but I think I wouldn't take the label and apply it as just like that to the movement, just like I wouldn't do the same with feminism, because I think it's a matter of history, and also one needs to take a decolonial approach here to acknowledge that different resistance traditions come from different places. And Öcalan and Bookchin actually both refer to the fact that resistance has always existed as long as unfreedom has existed. So in that sense, these more modern kind of practices, they are important and they need to be seen and acknowledged, but we can have a much more connected history that explains the ways in which different traditions have influenced each other. Because I think, for example, many anarchists in the recent past have also been very much inspired by the Kurdistan freedom movement itself. So can you then say they are necessarily democratic confederalists? You know?
Okay, good. I think that's perfect. Yeah, that's perfect. I mean, there is something to be said, and there's some interesting work to be done on anarchism as this product of the Enlightenment, as this European thing that starts with Gottman or Proudhon or whatever. I'm much more interested in the longue durée thing, and I'm happy to use, you know, the lowercase a word anarchism to describe it. And wherever its origins are, they go further back than we can remember, and they certainly did not begin in the 18th century on the European continent. And that is the sense that I'm interested in anarchism. Okay, so we've got our two great men out of the way, and we've properly situated them in history and culture, so they are not the heroic lone individual of someone's great man imagination. It's time to finally talk about what, you know, the Kurdish women's movement looks like on the ground. What would you like people to know about what it's like to be a woman taking part in this revolutionary movement in Rojava?
So I think one of the most important things that people always need to keep in the back of their mind is that Kurdistan is an incredibly patriarchal place, just like many other parts of the Middle East or the world. It's not easy to be a woman in that part of the world, which is also shaped by war, violence, forced displacement. So it's not something to be taken for granted that there is now a several millions strong radical revolutionary women's movement that is organized through structures. It's not a vague movement in the sense that sometimes people describe a time in history as a movement. It is an organized, a very highly structured, identifiable and defined kind of movement. So it's not a protest movement also. This is something I think also to keep in mind. It's not a movement that emerged spontaneously. It's like it's been in the making for quite a long time. So in that sense, much has happened ever since. So it was not easy to be so visible for Kurdish women, even at the beginning of this struggle in the 70s or 80s, as it is today. So much of the ability of Kurdish women to now be present in the public, to speak up, wherever they are, is in much to a great extent owed to the political struggle. It's not something inherent to Kurdish culture necessarily. Some people who are a bit more nationalistic may like to think that, Kurdish women are just kind of naturally more free or something like that. I think that's not a healthy and also a historical way of approaching it. This is an outcome of struggle. So in different parts of Kurdistan and also in the diaspora, the Kurdish movement, the Kurdistan freedom movement and the women's movement in particular is organized from the bottom up through communes and assemblies, but there are also larger umbrella structures in the different contexts. So inside Turkey, for example, which is a NATO country, which is a very authoritarian regime, it's very difficult for Kurdish women to freely organize. But at the same time, there are people in the legal, political sphere, there are women in politics, for example, but also much work is being done on the ground. In Rojava, in 2012, in northern Syria, this was the first time in the history of this movement where there was a larger space where it was possible to actually implement these ideas in practice of radical democratic self-organization through direct democracy, through assembly structures and things like that, to institutionalize it also, to put the ideas into practice. Inside Iraq, the situation is a bit difficult because of the fact there is a Kurdistan regional government that isn't, friendly with this kind of project. But there in the refugee camp of Mahmur, for example, since the early 2000s, These ideas have also been kind of part of the self-organization of this refugee camp, which also has a women's assembly, a women's academy, youth assemblies, which all have developed their own social contracts and are, resisting the attacks of the Turkish state, which regularly now is bombing that place, is conducting drone strikes and things like that. And then also, of course, there is a struggle in the mountains, which is not just an armed struggle. The guerrillas are also very much producing culturally. They have programs, they have publications. There's a huge media infrastructure of the Kurdistan Freedom Movement. There are several autonomous women's media outlets, including one all-women television. There's publications like newspapers and things like that. And also inside Europe, there's women's and people's assemblies everywhere. So as you can see, this is already, the project of democratic confederalism evolves in these different paths in different ways, because the conditions are different in Syria than they are in Germany, for example. But overall, what unites this whole framework is this ideological commitment to the framework laid out by Abdullah Öcalan. And it is a process of decolonizing life from the state, I would say. So it's trying to be a political community and an agent in history, if you will, without having a state and without aspiring towards having one. This does not mean that one doesn't want self-determination. That doesn't mean that one will just accept state violence. So it also includes self-defense. It includes all kinds of work towards internationalist coalition building and things like that. And the women's movement has been on the front of that. But so while there's on one hand these like very big, internationally focused, oriented kind of claims of the movement, and so much of it is also theory, so much of the movement's work is also education towards its own community, but also together with other revolutionaries and social movements in different parts of the world. But on the other hand, really so much of the work of the movement is also in the everyday lives. So for example, in Rojava, there have been so many new women's cooperatives, for example. There's a women's village that has been formed, women's educations, consciousness raising kind of seminars, people, for the first time learning about their own body, people for the first time talking about questions that have historically been tabooized. And so it's basically rendering a population that has historically been deprived of its means to self-defense, means of economy and everything, to give them the tools to self-organize. And the women's dynamic is particularly important here, because the idea is that women just participating in whatever political struggle is not enough. They need to be and the youth as well, and any other oppressed and marginalized identity. This includes also religious minorities, for example, in Kurdistan. They need to have their own autonomous decision-making mechanisms, and these actually get to veto the general mixed structures. So there is an internal democracy also inside the movement. Which, nothing is perfect, but it is basically a way of establishing mechanisms of accountability inside the movement. And the women's movement develops its own perspectives. It has its own takes on different issues. It has its own strategic alliance building work, its own self-defense structures, its own media work. And this is to say, historically, and this is something that the Kurdish women's movement has studied, especially in the 90s, is to say, women have always participated in different freedom struggles, in anti-colonial movements, in all kinds of different places. But they were often, not necessarily a collective actor that could defend also the interests of an entire group in society. But they were either individuals who had to really fight really hard and were often targeted, assassinated, and so on, or they were quite separate from the society, and so they couldn't really do anything that was transformative towards the society as a whole. So in that sense, any kind of liberation struggle needs to have these internally has to have autonomous structures for oppressed or marginalized communities within that society, just to make sure there is the guarantee for freedom. So it's not a freedom in the abstract, but it's a revolution that is organized in the everyday. So people see the weapons and the images of women who are speaking out, who are doing, all kinds of like spectacular activity, but actually So much of the work and the labor of this movement, I would say, is invisible labor, which includes education, which includes all kinds of like, logistical work, self-organization for basic survival in some places, but also in other places, yeah, just planning ahead and seeing how to protect that which has been built. Hope that makes sense.
It absolutely makes sense. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because I personally, and this is a very contentious topic in within the feminist discussion in the US, I'm quite skeptical of sort of women only spheres, a quotas based system, that sort of thing, because I associate it with a kind of essentialism, which can turn into, trans exclusionary thinking, and also can just, turn into a lack of freedom. If you are a woman, you must be this way. This kind of goes into this nationalist narrative. Kurdish women are different. And I was thrilled to see in your book, your, I think, quite brief explanation that this is about integrating women into society, giving them space, as opposed to segregating women from society. It's not that the women's groups are separate and apart, but it's a place for the people who would have been marked out for non-participation to be marked in for participation. And I just thought that distinction, as again, an outsider with so little information on this movement, I thought that distinction in your book was crucial.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm happy to hear that. And I think it's also about, again, it comes back to the question of just how much patriarchy there is in Kurdish society. Women also needed, especially in the 90s, spaces to actually find out that other people also disagree with this kind of subjugation, to like talk freely, to detabooize, for the first time talk about things that are very intimate in nature, and that safe space was needed, but it was always done in a way that is entangled with the wider struggle. And to say, no, we're not going to create a safe haven for us. Actually, we're here radicalizing so that we can be even stronger as a collective in the wider. So because this is, I think maybe I can share this here also for other people who are interested in organizational methods. It is the principle of the women's movement to not criticize other women in the presence of men, but to keep that criticism for the time when there is a more autonomous space, because that criticism or anything can be, of course, everybody should be able to criticize the works also of the women's movement or of individuals. But usually people may pay attention to always be like a unified front and to criticize each other in the places where it's much more appropriate, where it cannot be like, taken as an occasion to then say, oh, the women, they don't get along and things like that. So likewise, for example, criticism, self-criticism, internal kind of democracy, these are all very important things. And this is all, again, to make sure that they can be individually as well as collectively a very, very transformative and crucial and actually relevant part in the wider struggle, whether it's the Kurdish struggle or any other place, as opposed to saying we just want to create like a place where we all agree with each other and things are fine. So yeah, it's a dialectical process.
Great. Well, I think we're running out of time, but that brings me to the last thing that I feel like we had to mention. I mean, I gave a group of my students, high school students, when I was teaching high school, one of Öcalan's brief readings about democratic confederalism, and they were quite inspired by it. They liked it, and it really is. I cannot stress this enough. And again, you cover this in the book. Democratic confederalism is not a model. Of course, it's not a model for a Kurdish state. It's also not a model for Kurdish independence. It's a potential model for autonomy as widely as it can be spread. It's not a Kurdish model, as you've said. It's drawn from things like Murray Bookchin, and of course the 1,000-year history of struggle for self-determination and autonomy. But it is, to my mind, and this will take us back to this wider anarchist movement, it is something that all of us who want to organize, who want to struggle from, it's not some special Kurdish recipe. It is a vision that can be adapted and implemented by any community that wishes to do so. And in that sense, it is a gift from the Kurdish people, as opposed to a Kurdish strategy.
Exactly. And this is where, again, people in Kurdistan, in the movement, for example, often say, you know, the biggest form of solidarity one can do is actually to organize also, because all forms of oppression, all violence is in this world connected. For example, the arms trade, much of it is based in Europe, you know, the weapons with which wars in the region are being led, with which places like Rojava are currently, as we speak, being targeted. So in that sense, you know, to see struggles in a connected manner and to learn from each other, to say, just like, you know, nobody can claim authorship about, you know, the term autonomy. This is just a way of exchanging experiences, to share, strengthen each other, and to engage in common struggle fronts, basically. So what works in some parts of Kurdistan even doesn't work in other parts of Kurdistan. Autonomy also means being paying attention to the specific context, and to see, you know, to have a good understanding of reading the society and community, understanding the local and the global at the same time. And this can only happen by engaging in dialogues. I think people who want to learn about the Kurdistan freedom movement should, in a way, you know, while acknowledging that so much of it comes from the experience of violence that the Kurdish people have experienced, you know, this is not to be underestimated, but at the same time, to not just look at it through the lens of this is the struggle of a people, but to see how does this also reflect struggle in general, the question of revolution in general, and how do different movements in the world relate to it, and what they can learn both from each other.
Thank you so much, Dilar. I would love to have you back on the show sometime. We've only scratched the surface. We can cover new developments or so much more of the book. This was such a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It was really a big pleasure for me as well. And I hope we stay in touch. And I hope, that people get inspired, not by the book itself, but by the many resistances that women and peoples around the world are engaged with. And I think learning from movements is one of the biggest things that we can do in this time of big global crisis. So thank you for this conversation, Graham.
Thanks, Dilar. It was wonderful.